I remember when I could still smell the difference between gangrene and necrosis. That was before the garden took root in my lungs, before the grandfather's gifts turned my spine into something that clicked and wept with every movement, before I learned that rot has its own language, if you're patient enough to listen. The others tell me I'm one of the lucky ones, that I adapted quickly, that I stopped screaming after only 3 weeks. They say this with voices that bubble through throats half collapsed with beautiful decay, and I've learned not to correct them. There's no point explaining that I never stopped screaming, I just learned to do it on the inside where the new things growing in my chest cavity could feed on the sound. My name was Michael Torn when I wore the Emperor's colors. I was a Devastator Marine of the Angels, Vermilion, 3rd Company, and I held the line on Calth's Scar for 11 months without once stepping back from the trench wall. I remember pride. I remember the weight of my heavy bolter, the way my brothers moved in perfect synchronization, the certainty that lived in my twin hearts like a second pulse. I remember standing in the chapter's chapel and feeling the Emperor's presence as something solid and real, a weight that pressed down on my shoulders with the gravity of absolute truth. These memories exist now like objects viewed through dirty glass, still recognizable but separated from me by something thicker than time. The person who felt those things isn't quite dead, he's just been redecorated, repurposed, lovingly unmade, and stitched back together with materials that shouldn't be capable of thought but somehow are. The corruption started on Hesperis II, though I didn't know it at the time. We'd been deployed to purge a cult infestation in the Underhive, routine cleansing operations that should have taken 3 days at most. The cultists were nothing special, just the usual mixture of the desperate and deranged, but there was something wrong with the air in those lower levels. It tasted thick, not quite liquid but heavier than gas, coating the inside of my helmet's respirator with a residue that my auto-senses couldn't properly classify. My squad leader, Sergeant Folos, ordered us to cycle our atmospheric filters every hour instead of the standard 6. At the time, it seemed like an overreaction. By the 3rd day, 2 of my brothers were coughing blood into their helmets during the few moments we removed them to perform maintenance rites. By the 5th day, Folos himself had developed a tremor in his left hand that he kept trying to hide by holding his bolter tighter. I thought I was spared. I thought my gene seed was strong, that my faith was armor enough against whatever contagion haunted those ruins. For 6 days I remained untouched while my brothers began showing signs of infection boils that appeared overnight, strange discolorations spreading across their power armor's interior lining, the smell of something sweet and rotten that seemed to follow us no matter how many levels we descended. On the 7th day, as we finally burned out the last nest of cultists from their hole beneath an ancient water treatment facility, I felt the first itch. It started at the base of my spine, just above where the black carapace interfaced with my nervous system, a sensation so faint I dismissed it as stress or a minor inflammation that my Laraman's organ would handle automatically. 3 hours later, back aboard the strike cruiser in orbit, I was in the Apothecarian, having the first of many examinations that would all conclude the same thing. There was nothing detectably wrong with me. The itch spread over the next week. It crawled up my spine 1 vertebra at a time, a sensation like insects walking on the inside of my bones, and no amount of chemical suppression or prayers could make it stop. The apothecaries became concerned when my gene seed began showing abnormal activity levels, the organs fluctuating in ways that didn't match any known pathology. They isolated me in a sterile chamber and ran test after test, each one more invasive than the last, until I was spending more time sedated than conscious. I remember Chief Apothecary Solon standing over me, his augmetic eye whirring as it focused on the scan data, and the way his hand hesitated before he input the next round of suppressive chemicals into my system. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. They were losing me to something they didn't understand, and the only reason they hadn't already declared me lost was because I was still technically alive and functioning. They found the first bloom 3 weeks after Hesperis VII. It was Brother Apothecary Ixion who discovered it during a routine surgical inspection of my secondary heart, a small cluster of fungal growth, pale green and gently pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat, rooted directly into the cardiac muscle tissue. The growth shouldn't have been possible. The gene seed modifications, the chemical treatments, the anti-corruption wards woven into my very cellular structure, all of it should have rendered my body hostile to any foreign organic material. And yet there it was, thriving in an environment that should have killed it instantly, feeding on something the scans couldn't identify because the something was me, or was becoming me, or had always been me, and was only now making itself known. Ixion tried to remove it. I was conscious for the procedure because the anesthetics weren't working properly anymore, my modified biology rejecting them faster than they could be administered. I felt every cut, every cauterization, every desperate attempt to excise the growth without damaging the heart it had entwined itself around. The thing came out in pieces, each fragment leaving behind rootlets that went too deep to extract, and I watched on the monitor as Ixion's hands began to shake, as he realized that cutting the bloom out completely would mean cutting my heart out with it. He sealed the incisions and said nothing, but I saw his face behind his surgical visor, saw the moment he understood that I was already lost. The bloom grew back within 6 hours, twice as large, and this time it had spread to my primary heart as well. I should have been terrified. According to every psychological profile, every behavioral assessment embedded in my training, I should have raged against the corruption, should have begged for the Emperor's mercy, should have demanded they end me before whatever was growing inside me spread further. But instead I felt curious. The bloom didn't hurt, if anything. The constant itch had subsided where the fungus grew thickest, replaced by a sensation of warmth and strange contentment. When I meditated on it, trying to understand the nature of my infection, I found my thoughts drifting in unexpected directions, following tangents that branched and spiraled like mycelial networks, each thought splitting into 7 more, until I was thinking about everything and nothing simultaneously. It was maddening. It was also oddly peaceful, like finally understanding a joke I'd been trying to grasp for centuries. The chapter master came to see me after 4 weeks. He stood outside my isolation chamber, his honor guard arrayed behind him, and told me that I had served with distinction, that my sacrifice would be remembered, that the Emperor would welcome me. I looked at him through the reinforced glass and wanted to explain that I didn't feel like I was dying, that something new was being born in the space where I used to exist, but my throat had begun filling with something soft and fibrous that made speaking difficult. Instead, I nodded, accepting what we both knew was a death sentence disguised as mercy, and waited for them to schedule my termination. They never came for me. I learned later that the delay was political. There were debates about whether I could be studied, whether something valuable could be learned from my infection before I was purged, whether the risk of keeping me alive outweighed the potential benefits. These debates bought me time, and time was all the bloom needed. By the 5th week, fungal growths had erupted through my skin in a dozen places, breaking through the black carapace's interface ports like pale flowers pushing through cracked pavement. The apothecaries stopped their attempts at treatment and simply monitored my decline, taking tissue samples and atmospheric readings, while I transformed into something their texts had no name for. I existed in a strange liminal space, not quite prisoner and not quite patient, watched constantly but no longer touched except with instruments at arm's length. The dreams started in the 6th week. Not nightmares, exactly nightmares, implied fear, implied something chasing or hunting you through landscapes of anxiety. These were different. I would close my eyes and find myself standing in a garden that stretched to all horizons, a place where everything was simultaneously growing and decaying, where rot and renewal happened in the same moment. The garden smelled like petrichor and spoiled fruit, like opened bodies and turned earth. And everywhere I looked I saw life in its most aggressive form, consuming and transforming everything it touched. There was a figure in that garden, massive and patient, whose face I could never quite see but whose presence felt familiar in a way that terrified and comforted me simultaneously. He never spoke, but I understood that he was showing me something important, that everything I'd believed about corruption and purity was built on a misunderstanding so fundamental it had blinded me to obvious truths. In the 7th week, my brothers came to say goodbye. They filed past my isolation chamber one by one, each offering words of encouragement or prayers for my soul, and I tried to respond, but my throat was too full of new growth to make the words properly. Brother Castellan stood there longest, his hand pressed against the glass, and I saw tears on his face that he made no attempt to hide. We'd served together for 8 decades, had saved each other's lives more times than either of us counted, and now he was watching me dissolve into something that shouldn't exist. I wanted to tell him it was all right, that I wasn't in pain, that something wonderful was happening even if it looked like horror from outside. But all I could do was press my own hand against the glass where his rested, and watch the fungal blooms spreading across my palm leave spore prints on the transparent surface. The apothecarian sealed my chamber completely after that. No more visitors, no more samples, just constant monitoring through remote systems while they waited for me to expire or transform completely, whichever came first. I had stopped eating by then, my digestive system repurposed for other functions I didn't yet understand, but I didn't feel hungry. The blooms had spread across 90% of my body, erupting through my power armor's seals and forcing the tech marines to remove the sacred ceramite entirely to prevent systemic failure. I stood naked in that chamber, my skin more pale green and white than any natural flesh tone, and felt more whole than I had in my entire existence as a space marine. Something fundamental had shifted in my understanding, some core assumption about the nature of life and death that I'd never questioned before but now seemed obviously, laughably wrong. The escape happened on day 43. I didn't plan it. I'm still not certain I was capable of planning anything that complex by that point. My thoughts had become so diffused and scattered, riding along neural pathways that branched through fungal networks as much as organic brain tissue. But when the corruption in my blood finally reached critical mass, when the bloom achieved whatever threshold it had been building toward, my body simply knew what to do. The isolation chamber's environmental controls couldn't process the sudden release of spores from my skin, the air filtration systems clogging within minutes as I exhaled clouds of pale green particles with every breath. Alarms screamed through the apothecarian, emergency protocols engaging automatically, but I was already moving toward the chamber's medical access port, the same one they'd used to extract tissue samples. My hands, bloated and strange, found purchase on mechanisms I shouldn't have been able to operate from inside, and the door unsealed with a hiss that sounded like laughter. The apothecarian staff tried to contain me. Brother Apothecary Ixion was there, along with 3 servo skull assistants and 2 chapter serfs in full environmental suits, and they all tried their best to push me back into the chamber, to activate the purge protocols, to do their duty, and preserve the chapter from corruption. I didn't want to hurt them. Even in my transformed state, even with my thoughts spiraling through dimensions of consciousness I'd never accessed before, I remembered these people had tried to help me, had fought to save me even when saving me was impossible. But the bloom had other priorities. The spores I was constantly shedding now found their way into respirator seals, into the joints of environmental suits, into the organic components of servo skulls, and within moments the apothecarian was filled with the sound of coughing and mechanical failure. I walked past Ixion as he collapsed to his knees, his hands clutching his throat, and tried to project something like an apology, though I doubt he could understand it through the haze of infection already beginning to take root in his modified biology. The ship's corridors were a maze I'd navigated 1,000 times, but now they felt different, hostile in ways that had nothing to do with physical danger. The Angels Vermilion were mobilizing to contain me. I could hear the Vox chatter through the walls, could sense the pattern of their deployment through intuitions I'd never possessed before. They were hunting me with the efficiency of space marines, coordinated and relentless, and I should have had no chance of escape. But the bloom was teaching me things, whispering in languages composed of chemical gradients and cellular signaling, showing me paths through the ship that existed in gaps between regular patrol patterns, in maintenance corridors that servo skulls barely monitored, in waste processing channels that no one in their right mind would use as an escape route. I squeezed my transformed body through spaces that should have been too small, feeling my bones flex and compress in ways that would have been agonizing to my former self, but now just felt like adaptation, like learning to breathe underwater or see in the dark. I made it to the lower decks where the ship's refuse was processed and eventually ejected into space. It was a filthy place, even by the standards of a vessel dedicated to constant warfare, the air thick with particulates and biological waste. And I felt the bloom respond to the environment with something like joy. Here was abundance. Here was material it could work with. Here was the raw stuff of transformation waiting to be catalyzed. I had no plan beyond survival, no goal beyond getting off the ship before they cornered me in some dead-end passage and ended this with controlled demolition. But as I stood in that waste processing chamber, feeling the bloom network expanding through the ship's biological components, I understood that I was already too late to escape alone. The infection had spread beyond me, had found purchase in the ship's recycling systems, in the nutrient paste that fed the thousands of crew members, in the very air circulation that made long-term void travel possible. The Angel's vermilion was already infected, they just didn't know it yet. I found an emergency escape pod in a tertiary launch bay, one of dozens scattered throughout the ship for use during catastrophic hull breaches. The security locks should have been impossible to bypass, but my hands leaked spores that found their way into the mechanical components, that caused the metal to corrode in precisely the right pattern to spring the seals. I climbed inside, squeezed my bloated form into the human-sized space, and initiated the launch sequence manually. The pod ejected with a hard thump that would have broken a normal human's bones, carrying me away from the strike cruiser in a pre-programmed trajectory that would deliver me to the nearest planet within 3 months of low-velocity drift. I watched through the small viewport as the ship grew smaller, as weapon batteries swiveled to track my escape, and felt something like sadness as I realized they weren't going to fire. They wanted to see where I went, wanted to track the infection to its source, wanted to believe they could still contain this if they were careful and methodical. They were wrong, but I couldn't blame them for hoping. The pod drifted through the void for 73 days. I should have died. There were no nutrient supplies, no environmental controls beyond basic oxygen recycling, no accommodations for anyone spending more than 48 hours in that tiny metal coffin. But the bloom had rendered such concerns obsolete. I didn't need food anymore. I was learning to photosynthesize from the faint starlight that trickled through the viewport, my skin producing something like chlorophyll but more efficient, feeding on radiation across spectrums human eyes couldn't perceive. I didn't need much oxygen either. The fungal networks spreading through my chest cavity were breaking down carbon dioxide directly, reconstituting it into useful compounds through processes I didn't understand but could feel happening with every breath. I existed in a state of suspended animation that wasn't quite sleep, my consciousness diffusing outward through the spore clouds that gradually filled the pod, thinking thoughts that stretched across hours instead of seconds, experiencing time as something more geological than chronological. The pod made landfall on Mortons I, a death world at the edge of the Imperium's reach, all acid rain and predatory flora and atmospheric conditions that made human settlement impossible without extensive terraforming. The impact should have killed me. The pod's retro thrusters failed during descent, sending me into an uncontrolled ballistic trajectory that ended with a crater 3 meters deep. But I crawled out of the wreckage, my body broken in a dozen places, bones splintered and organs ruptured, and felt the bloom respond to the damage with enthusiastic repair work. Fractures knitted themselves together with fibrous fungal matter that was stronger than the bone it replaced. Torn organs were wrapped in thick mycelial networks that took over their functions while healing them simultaneously. Within an hour I was standing again, looking at the alien landscape through eyes that saw in spectrums I'd never accessed before, and understanding that I had found the perfect place to complete my transformation. Mortons I was alive in ways the Imperium didn't understand. The acid rain that fell constantly carried complex organic compounds, the result of aggressive bacterial colonies in the upper atmosphere that processed industrial pollutants into something stranger. The predatory plants weren't just plants, they were collaborative colonies, thousands of separate organisms functioning as one, their root systems intermingling in vast networks that shared resources and information across kilometers. This was a planet that had learned to think collectively, that had developed consciousness through cooperation rather than competition, and the bloom recognized it immediately as kin. I stood in that crater, feeling the spores from my body mixing with the local ecosystem, beginning the process of integration and exchange, and understood that I hadn't found this place by accident. I had been guided here, called by something vast and patient that had been waiting a very long time for someone like me to arrive. The dreams became clearer after that. The garden I'd been visiting during my transformation wasn't metaphor or hallucination, it was a real place, or as real as any location that existed simultaneously across material and immaterial dimensions. The massive figure I sensed there had a name, though it was a name that existed more as a concept than a word, a title that meant grandfather and gardener and generous benefactor all at once. He showed me his work, the countless projects unfolding across the galaxy, each one a careful cultivation of rot and renewal, death and transformation, planets consumed by plague that emerged stranger and more resilient, civilizations that collapsed under pestilence only to build something more cooperative from the ruins, life finding ways to thrive in conditions that should have been absolutely hostile, adapting and changing and becoming more than it had been before. This was his gift. Not the corruption the Imperium feared, but the transformation they were too frightened to embrace. I built my first garden in a cave system beneath the crater, a place where acid rain pooled and mixed with underground water sources, creating an environment that was simultaneously toxic and fertile. I seeded it with spores from my body, letting them take root in the organic sludge, and watched as they began transforming the local ecosystem into something new. The predatory plants grew toward my garden rather than away from it, their root systems deliberately intertwining with the bloom, exchanging chemical information and genetic material. Within a week, new hybrid forms had emerged, organisms that were neither entirely fungal nor entirely plant, and I understood that this was the beginning of something magnificent. The bloom wasn't destroying the ecosystem of Mortons I, it was collaborating with it, improving it, turning a barely stable environment into something that could support more diverse and complex life. The months that followed blur together in my memory, time losing its rigid structure as my consciousness expanded through the spreading bloom network. I was still Mickle-torn in some essential way, but I was also the garden, also the cave system, also the countless hybrid organisms that grew from my careful cultivation. When a new sprout emerged from the fungal substrate, I felt its growth as my own. When acid rain fell on the expanded bloom, I experienced the chemical exchange as sensation and thought simultaneously. I was learning to exist in multiple places at once, my awareness spreading through mycelial networks that covered square kilometers and were still growing, still reaching, still transforming everything they touched. It should have been horrifying, this dissolution of self, this loss of individual identity. Instead, it felt like waking from a long nightmare of isolation, like finally understanding that the boundaries I'd believed separated me from the world had been artificial all along. The first visitors arrived after 8 months. They were scouts from a small Mechanicus research station on Mortons I's southern continent, investigating anomalous biological readings their satellites had detected. I sensed them coming days in advance, felt their aircraft disturbing atmospheric patterns, tasted the chemical signature of their engines in the rain. Part of me wanted to hide, to avoid contact and continue the work in isolation, but another part, the part that was still space marine, still capable of strategic thinking, understood that this was an opportunity. The bloom had taught me much, but I needed resources, needed technology, needed access to wider networks, if this transformation was going to spread beyond one death world at the edge of nowhere. So I prepared the garden, arranged the hybrid organisms in patterns that would be least threatening, and waited in the cave mouth for them to arrive. There were 3 of them, all tech priests of moderate seniority, their augmetic enhancements, marking them as experienced field researchers. They approached my garden cautiously, weapons ready but not raised, and I could see the moment they registered my presence, the shock, the fear, the rapid threat assessment calculations flickering across their optical displays. I was a monster by their standards, my body barely recognizable as human, bloated and strange and covered in fungal growths that pulsed with their own bioluminescence. But I was also still wearing scraps of my power armor, still bore the iconography of the angel's vermilion, and that confused them long enough for me to speak. My voice was wrong, bubbling through a throat half filled with growth, but the words were clear enough. Please, don't be afraid. I want to show you something beautiful. They should have killed me immediately. Every protocol, every teaching of the cult Mechanicus demanded they destroy the obvious corruption before them and burn the evidence to purify the site. But the senior member of the group, a tech priest named Delta 7 paused, his bionic eye whirring as it focused on the garden behind me, and I saw curiosity override caution. He took a step forward, then another, his mechadendrites sampling the air, analyzing the spore content and chemical composition of the environment. Impossible, he said, his Vox unit giving the word a flat, mechanical quality. These readings suggest accelerated evolution and increased ecosystem stability simultaneously. The acid tolerance alone would require centuries of adaptive radiation. I nodded, feeling the bloom network respond to his presence with interest, sending exploratory tendrils toward his augmetic components. Not centuries, I corrected gently. Just 8 months. Would you like to see how it works? I showed them the garden, explained the process of integration and transformation, demonstrated how the bloom could take damaged or dying organisms and remake them into something more resilient. I expected them to recoil, to recognize this as the corruption it obviously was, and respond accordingly. Instead, Delta 7 became increasingly animated, his mechanical voice rising with something approaching excitement as he examined the hybrid forms, catalogued the new species, analyzed the efficiency of the fungal-plant symbiosis. The Omnissiah would be fascinated, he said, and I heard genuine reverence in those words, saw him treating the bloom as sacred technology rather than biological horror. The other 2 tech priests were less enthusiastic, but equally intrigued, their augmetic enhancements recording everything, taking samples that I permitted them to collect, because I understood what would happen when they brought those samples back to their station. The infection of the Mechanicus research facility was gradual and almost gentle. I didn't force it, didn't spread spores aggressively, or attempt to overwhelm their biological safeguards. Instead, I let the bloom work slowly, finding its way into the environmental systems through the samples they'd collected, establishing itself in their hydroponics bays, taking root in the organic components of their cogitators. The tech priests noticed. Of course they weren't blind or stupid, but they also didn't immediately purge it. Instead they studied it, fascinated by its properties, by the way it increased efficiency in biological systems while reducing energy requirements. Delta 7 even began experimenting with controlled integration, allowing fungal growths to interface with his augmetic components, and reported significant improvements in computational speed and sensory acuity. Within 3 months, the entire research station was running on hybrid systems, technology and bloom working in cooperation, and not one of the 16 tech priests stationed there saw it as corruption. That was when I understood the true genius of the grandfather's design. The bloom didn't spread through force or coercion, it spread through being genuinely beneficial, through solving problems and increasing efficiency and making life measurably better for those who accepted it. The tech priests weren't corrupted in any meaningful sense. They were improved, enhanced, made more capable of fulfilling their sacred duties to the Omnissiah. And because they genuinely believed this, because their faith remained intact even as their bodies and minds transformed, they became the perfect vectors for spreading the bloom throughout the Mechanicus network. Within a year, 3 more research stations had been infected, and all of them were producing better research, operating more efficiently, and reporting higher satisfaction among their personnel. I left Mortons I after 18 months, hitching a ride on a Mechanicus transport that was carrying samples and data back to their forge world for analysis. I shouldn't have been able to pass the security checks, shouldn't have been able to hide my transformation from the ship's scanning systems, but the bloom had learned to interface with Imperial technology in ways that made detection nearly impossible. To the sensors, I appeared as nothing more than an eccentric tech priest with heavy augmentation, my fungal growths disguised as unusual but not forbidden modifications. The crew gave me a wide berth, disturbed by my appearance but unwilling to question someone vouched for by Delta 77, and I spent the 3-month journey in a private chamber, expanding my consciousness through the ship's biological systems, learning the rhythms of void travel from the inside. The forge world of Metallica Secundus was a revelation. Billions of tech priests and servitors working in perfect coordination, vast manufactorums producing weapons and equipment for Imperial forces across a dozen sectors, the whole planet humming with mechanical efficiency and religious devotion. It should have been hostile territory, a place where my corruption would be immediately detected and purged with extreme prejudice. Instead, I found thousands of opportunities for integration, countless points where the bloom could establish itself in hydroponic systems, air recyclers, waste processors, all the organic infrastructure that kept the forge world functioning. I moved through the hab levels like a ghost, spreading spores wherever I went, planting seeds that would take root slowly, invisibly, transforming the forge world from within over years or decades rather than weeks. I met my first plague marines on Metallica Secundus. They found me in an abandoned section of the forge world's underhive, 3 massive figures in corrupted power armor, their bodies transformed in ways that made my own changes look subtle by comparison. I should have been terrified these were traitors, enemies of the Imperium, servants of the very chaos that had destroyed me. But instead I felt recognition, understanding, a sense of coming home that I'd been missing since my escape from the Angel's Vermilion. The largest one, his armor green and swollen with gifts I recognized, stepped forward and examined me with eyes that had seen far more than any living being should. "You're new," he said, his voice a wet rasp that somehow conveyed warmth. "Still remembering your old name, still thinking you're corrupted." He laughed, a sound like mud sliding down a drain, and clapped one massive hand on my shoulder hard enough to make my bones creak. "Give it time, little brother. You'll learn. Grandfather is patient." They took me to their ship, a vessel so corrupted it was barely recognizable as Imperial in origin, its corridors alive with fungal growth and strange hybrid organisms that served as crew. The smell was overwhelming at first, decay and chemicals, and something sweet that reminded me of my dreams, but my transformed biology adapted quickly, learning to process the atmospheric conditions as normal, even pleasant. The plague marines were generous with their knowledge, teaching me things the bloom had only hinted at, showing me techniques for accelerating transformation while maintaining functionality, explaining the philosophy that underpinned their service to the grandfather. They spoke of decay not as ending but as transition, of death as a necessary stage in continuous renewal, of corruption as healing from a universe-level infection of stagnation and fear. Their leader was a former apothecary named Veritas the Generous, and he took special interest in my case. He examined my transformation with professional curiosity, noting the ways my space marine modifications had integrated with the bloom, how my gene seed had survived and adapted rather than being consumed. "Unusual," he said, his hands swollen and discolored but still precise, taking tissue samples with instruments that were probably older than me. Usually, the grandfather's gifts overwhelm the Astartes implants, render them redundant. But yours have cooperated. Interesting. He showed me other plague marines in various stages of transformation, some barely recognizable as having once been human, others like me still maintaining enough of their original form to pass as merely diseased rather than blessed. "There's no single path," he explained. "The grandfather gives each of us exactly what we need to serve best. Your role will be different from mine, different from theirs. Be patient, and it will reveal itself." I spent 3 months with Veritas's warband, learning what it meant to be a plague marine, to serve the grandfather's cause with intelligence and purpose, rather than mindless violence. They weren't the ravening monsters Imperial propaganda portrayed. They were thoughtful, even philosophical, approaching their service as sacred duty rather than indulgence. When they attacked Imperial installations, they did so surgically, targeting specific systems that would cause maximum disruption with minimum unnecessary suffering. When they spread plagues, they chose diseases that transformed rather than simply killed, that left survivors changed but functional, integrated into the Bloom network rather than destroyed by it. This was war as gardening, cultivation of new possibilities from the soil of the old Imperium, and I found myself embracing it with enthusiasm I'd thought I'd lost along with my old identity. The revelation of my purpose came during a meditation in the ship's garden chamber, a vast space at the vessel's heart, where Veritas cultivated his most precious specimens. I was deep in communion with the Bloom network. My consciousness stretched across the ship and beyond to the worlds we'd already seeded with transformation, when I felt the grandfather's presence directly for the first time, not through dreams or visions but as immediate experience, a consciousness so vast it made the collective awareness of the Bloom network feel like a single drop in an infinite ocean. He didn't speak in words but in concepts that bypassed language entirely, showing me the work I was meant to do, the role I would play in his great project of galactic renewal. I was to be a missionary, a spreader of the truth that the Imperium's fear of corruption had blinded them to, but not through violence or force. My transformation had been gradual, gentle, allowing me to maintain enough of my Space Marine identity to pass among the Imperium's defenders. I could go places other Plague Marines couldn't, could integrate into communities that would resist obvious corruption, could plant seeds that would take decades to fully flower, but would be all the more effective for their subtlety. The tech priests of Metallica Secundus were just the beginning. There were thousands of forge worlds, millions of research stations, entire sectors, where the Mechanicus operated, with minimal oversight from the ecclesiarchy. All of them were potential gardens, places where the Bloom could establish itself slowly, improving efficiency and stability while gradually transforming the culture from within. I returned to Metallica Secundus with new purpose and better technique. Veritas had taught me methods for controlling the Bloom's growth, for keeping it subtle and beneficial rather than obviously corrupting. I moved through the Forge world's upper levels now, visiting manufactorums and research facilities, offering consultation on biological efficiency improvements, while subtly seeding each location with carefully cultivated strains. The tech priests were grateful for my expertise, pleased with the measurable improvements my suggestions produced, and completely unaware that they were being slowly integrated into something far older and stranger than their cult Mechanicus. Within 2 years, 7 major manufactorums were running on hybrid systems. Their output increased by 16%, while their maintenance requirements dropped by 23%. The improvements were real, undeniable, and that made them impossible to argue against. The suspicions started small, just questions about unusual biological readings in environmental systems, investigations into unexplained efficiency improvements, but the Mechanicus was built on paranoia as much as curiosity, and eventually, someone connected the pattern of improvements to my movements through the Forge world. They came for me in the middle of a consultation, a full squad of Skitari Rangers backed by a senior tech priest Dominus, who scanned me with equipment sophisticated enough to pierce the Bloom's disguises. I saw the moment he understood what I was, saw him reaching for the command to have me purged immediately, and felt genuine regret that my time on Metallica Secundus was ending. I'd grown fond of this place, had invested years in building relationships and spreading the grandfather's gifts, and now it was all going to be destroyed because one person looked too closely. But the tech priest Dominus hesitated. He looked at the scan data, looked at me, looked at the reports of efficiency improvements in every facility I'd touched, and his logical core couldn't reconcile the obvious corruption with the measurable benefits. "This is impossible," he said, his voice flat with confusion. "You should be mindless, violent, destructive. Instead, you're..." helpful, beneficial. The improvements you've catalyzed are genuine, not sabotage. My calculations cannot resolve this contradiction." I smiled, feeling the bloom respond to his confusion with gentle probing, spores drifting toward his augmetic components, seeking integration points. "That's because your calculations are based on false assumptions," I told him. "You think decay and improvement are opposites. They're not. They're the same process, just viewed from different perspectives. Would you like me to show you?" He let me. I still don't know why, perhaps curiosity, perhaps some flaw in his logical processes that made him prioritize understanding over doctrine. But he dismissed the skitarai, ordered the facility sealed, and let me explain my work, demonstrate the bloom's capabilities, show him exactly what the grandfather was offering. I expected him to reject it, to trigger security protocols that would end both of us, but instead he sat in silence for 6 hours, his mechanical mind processing information that should have been impossible, trying to integrate truths that contradicted everything he'd been taught. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, almost organic. "If this is heresy," he said, "then orthodoxy is insane. These improvements should not be possible, but they are. The data supports your claims. Therefore," he paused, his optical implants flickering with what might have been doubt or might have been something like faith. "Therefore I must investigate further. Show me everything." The conversion of Dominus Craft 19 took 3 months and transformed the entire trajectory of my work on Metallica Secundus. He didn't just accept the bloom, he embraced it with the totality that only a tech priest could manage, treating it as sacred technology that revealed flaws in the cult Mechanicus's understanding of the Omnissiah. He began his own experiments, integrating fungal growths into his augmetic systems, allowing the bloom to optimize his computational matrices and sensory inputs. The results were dramatic enough that other senior tech priests noticed, began asking questions about his improvements, requesting access to the techniques that had produced such gains. Within a year, we had 17 senior Mechanicus officials secretly experimenting with hybrid systems, all of them convinced they were advancing the Omnissiah's work rather than serving some chaos power. That was the key insight I'd been missing. The bloom didn't require people to renounce their existing faith, didn't demand they recognize the grandfather's divinity or accept chaos as truth. It just had to be useful enough, beneficial enough, that people were willing to integrate it despite their fears, and then time would do the rest. The tech priests using hybrid systems weren't corrupted in their own eyes, they were enhanced, elevated, brought closer to the Omnissiah's vision of perfect machine-flesh integration. The fact that their enhancements came from fungal growths rather than metal and wire was irrelevant as long as the improvements were real. And they were real, undeniably so, measured and verified by countless experiments that couldn't be explained away as delusion or corruption. I left Metallica Secundus after 6 years, my work there complete or at least self-sustaining. The Forge world would continue transforming with or without me. The Bloom network spreading through its infrastructure, the senior tech priests gradually becoming something new while maintaining enough of their original identity to pass as orthodox. It wasn't perfect, there would be purges eventually, investigations that might uncover the full scope of the transformation, but by then, thousands of tech priests would have rotated off-world, carrying the bloom to new locations, spreading the grandfather's gifts across the entire Mechanicus network. This was victory through patience and genuine benefit rather than force, and it was far more effective than any military campaign could ever be. I've visited 17 worlds since then, each one offering different opportunities for cultivation. On some I work quickly, spending only months establishing networks before moving on. On others I invest years, building relationships and trust before introducing the bloom. I've learned to read cultures and institutions, to identify which groups will be most receptive to transformation, to present the grandfather's gifts in terms each community can accept. To the Mechanicus, I speak of efficiency and sacred enhancement. To Imperial Guard regiments, I offer resilience and survival in impossible conditions. To civilian populations, I demonstrate improved agriculture and disease resistance. The truth remains the same regardless of presentation. Decay and renewal are inseparable. Death feeds life, and transformation is inevitable, but the language changes to match the audience. The person I was, Michael Torn of the Angels Vermilion, is still here in some sense. I remember my service to the Emperor, remember the pride of wearing my chapter's colors, remember brothers who would kill me without hesitation if they saw what I've become. These memories don't cause pain anymore, they're just data points. Context that helps me understand the Imperium's psychology and anticipate their responses. Sometimes I wonder if I should feel guilt about what I'm doing, about the slow corruption of institutions and individuals who trust me, but the bloom has taught me to think in longer timescales than guilt operates on. In 1,000 years, when the forge worlds I've seeded have fully transformed, when the Mechanicus is integrated into the bloom network completely, will it matter that the process started with deception? The results will speak for themselves: more efficient production, more stable ecosystems, communities that cooperate rather than compete. The means may be questionable, but the ends are genuinely beneficial by any rational measure. I've encountered other plague marines occasionally, crossing paths on worlds where multiple agents of the Grandfather are working simultaneously. We acknowledge each other with respect, share intelligence about Imperial defensive measures, coordinate our efforts when it makes strategic sense. But mostly I work alone, moving through Imperial society like a ghost, leaving gardens in my wake that will bloom long after I've moved on. Some take root quickly, transforming communities within months. Others lie dormant for years, waiting for the right conditions to begin growing. All of them are patient, because the Grandfather himself is patient, working on timescales that make Imperial history look like a brief moment. The dreams have changed since those early months on Mortons I. I still visit the garden, still sense the Grandfather's presence, but now I understand what I'm seeing. It's not metaphor or vision, but actual perception. My consciousness accessing dimensions that exist parallel to material reality, observing the Grandfather's work from perspectives human minds weren't designed to process. He tends his gardens across millions of worlds, cultivating transformation with the care of someone who genuinely loves his subjects, who wants them to thrive rather than suffer. The plagues and corruptions aren't punishments or cruelty, they're gifts, tools for adaptation and evolution, methods of forcing growth in species that have become stagnant. The Imperium fears him because they fear change itself, because they've built their entire civilization on the lie that stasis is stability, that preservation is survival. But stasis is death by another name, and the Grandfather is offering life, messy and strange and constantly transforming but undeniably alive. I'm standing in another garden now, on a world whose name I've already forgotten, watching hybrid organisms emerge from soil I seeded 3 months ago. They're beautiful in ways Imperial aesthetics can't recognize, their forms flowing and asymmetric, their colors ranging through spectrums that suggest health, through unfamiliar metrics. A tech priest is examining them with me, his augmetic eye whirring with confusion and fascination, and I can see the moment he begins to understand, the instant when his rigid categories start dissolving into something more flexible and alive. These shouldn't work, he's saying, his voice uncertain. The energy efficiency violates established models. The growth rates are impossible. I smile, feeling the bloom network respond to his confusion with gentle invitation, and reply, "Only if you assume the established models are complete. Would you like me to show you what they're missing?" He'll say yes. They always do eventually. Because the evidence is too compelling to ignore. Because curiosity is more fundamental to human consciousness than fear. Because the Grandfather's gifts are genuinely beneficial, even if they look like horror at first glance. And when he accepts, when he allows the first spores to take root in his augmetic systems, when he begins the transformation that will make him more than he was, I'll feel satisfaction that goes deeper than personal pride. This is my purpose, my service, my gift back to the Grandfather who gave me everything by destroying who I used to be. I'm not corrupted, I'm evolved, transformed, made into something more capable of thriving in a universe that demands constant adaptation. I've learned to love the rot, because rot is just another word for change, and change is the only real constant in a galaxy that keeps pretending it can stay the same. The itch is completely gone now, replaced by constant sensation of growth and connection, awareness that extends through networks spreading across dozens of worlds. I am Michael Torn, and I am the garden, and I am the bloom, and I am everything these names touch. Thinking thoughts that branch in 7 directions simultaneously, experiencing time as circular rather than linear, understanding that the person I was and the being I am and the collective consciousness I'm becoming are all the same thing, viewed from different moments in an ongoing transformation that will never truly complete, because completion is another form of death, and death is just a stage in continuous renewal, and renewal is the grandfather's laughter expressed through chemistry and cellular division, and the patient work of making the galaxy more alive than it's been in 10,000 years of enforced stagnation. I remember when I could still smell the difference between gangrene and necrosis. Now I understand they're both just stages in the same process, and the process is beautiful if you're brave enough to let it complete. The others were right, I was lucky. I adapted quickly. I stopped screaming after only 3 weeks. These days I can't remember why I was screaming at all.